Well, hi, and good morning. Hi, Dan. Welcome to our little chat. I think we have I have a few things to talk about today, but I wanted to invite you in to talk a little bit about the history of light sport. We're kind of moving into the whole MOSAIC thing, and we've had light sport for a couple of decades now, and I thought it'd be interesting to go back in time a little bit and review what happened, how did we get here, and get your perspective on it, because you were certainly a mainstream in all this, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah, I was there when it got going, all right, and that it went. I forget what the term FAA uses, but it became actual law. It was implemented in September of 2004. So yeah, we're coming up on a 20-year anniversary here very soon. But to me, Mark, there were two phases before light sport came along. I go way back into the days of hang gliding, and I did that because at the time I couldn't afford airplanes too much. They were a lot cheaper than they were today, but I was a lot poorer than I am today. So hang gliding was something I could afford, and it allowed me to get in the air and soar around and do some things that I enjoyed, and I could afford the equipment and so forth. But then those things got powered over time. People started to invent how to put engines on them, and they became ultimately, I'm squashing time down a lot here, but they became ultralights quite a few years later. And ultralights then led to light sport. So in a sense, I was kind of hanging around before we knew what the category was. And I have had a front row seat to it. It's been kind of fun, Mark.
And I think if we look back on that period, we had issues with the certified airplanes becoming increasingly more expensive. And, ultralights, powered parachutes, all of that at the light end was really a response to like, hey, as you say, I don't have a ton of money, but I really want to fly. And I think in that period, we started to see the prices really start to separate out, where it became just crazy expensive for some of the newer airplanes, and the production rates were down and all of that. So it seemed like the right time for a resurgence or a new place in the world for aircraft, and certainly an opening in that price point, wouldn't you say?
Well, definitely so, Mark. And at the very beginning, this was as much sport as it was aviation. It was sport aviation. I mean, that's EAA's title magazine. And so, everyone gets it that all these kind of little airplanes that we enjoy are for recreation. I mean, that's really what they're for. But there was really a sport element to it, especially in the hang gliding period, because there was something physical to it. You had to pick up your hang glider, carry it, support it, balance it, and run off a mountain or whatever it is it took to get in the air. So there was definitely an athletic side to it. So there was an early element to it that people, in fact, in hang gliding and paragliding, in powered parachuting and those kinds of activities, maybe even trike flying, many of them refer to what they're doing as a sport. Oh, the sport is having this success or that success or this problem or that problem. They don't talk about it as aviation. Of course, that's what it is, but they don't talk about it that way. So there was definitely that element to it. But as time goes on, you look at cars, you look at any product in the world, computers, even AI these days, anything. It develops rapidly for a while, and then game changes a lot, and people veer off in different directions and try different things. And that's ultimately what led to this over a long time. Now, all that also happened from the early 70s. Part 103 and ultralights became a regulation in 1982. So they were thinking about it well back into the 70s as they began to do the work that led to that. So this thing has gone on since basically the mid or early 70s. That's when I got involved with hang gliding. And during that same amount of time, we've had quite an interesting economy. And that and the increasing complexity of airplanes and their increasing capabilities combined to raise the prices way up. I mean, it just kept getting more expensive. So these things that some people captioned under sport continued to have appeal, even while a lot of airplanes had cool equipment and could go far, fast, or whatever. But most people still couldn't reach it. In fact, I would say that's still true today.
Absolutely. So if you think about the economics of the period, it was difficult to find an opening there. And certainly the FAA and people in the industry recognized that problem. So you had categories or the primary category, which was one of those, I'm going to say, almost stillborn efforts to reduce the cost of aircraft certification, And in theory, if you reduce the cost of certification and make them a little bit simpler, you can reduce the cost of the final airplane. Well, without getting off on a rant there, we certainly didn't see much come out of primary category. So my question for you then is, knowing that and having that
recreational pilot.
Exactly.
Those two came together just like light sport and sport pilot came together. Recreational pilot and primary category came together. And honestly, they were both duds. FAA, well, I wouldn't blame FAA for that. It was probably a noble try, but it was basically the same old game. Do it a little bit differently than you had been doing it and hope that somehow something better was going to happen.
And it always felt like it was a bit watered down and a little inspecific. So my question to you is, knowing that, having that as the background, did that inform the thinking on LSA? Was it this opportunity? It's like, hey, primary category doesn't really work, doesn't do what we hoped it would do. How do we change our outlook and make LSA actually work?
Well, there was a window there. As I recall, the Quicksilver GT500, which was the first aircraft to receive primary category. It was basically an ultralight, if you will, a bit of a grown-up one, so it could qualify as something else, I suppose. But it was the first one. I believe that year was 1993, if memory serves. And so a decade later, Light Sport came out. Well, in that time, they were certainly looking at, what was happening, but it honestly wasn't enough time really to tell that primary category was just not going to go anywhere. They began to get the idea right away. There's a huge difference here, I'll explain. In primary category, after they finally released it, and they did water it down some, but they didn't take out some of the detail and expense of it. So it didn't do as much, but it cost a lot. And, that's not really the right combination. I think they began to see this because I think 3 or 4 airplanes in that whole decade ever got primary category. Now, there's been a few that have done it since. Even Icon went down this path with it. Cessna looked into it with their Skycatcher because they wanted to get in overseas markets where it did make some sense to do this thing because they accepted the older style regulation better than this new thing that came along, this industry consensus standards idea. But in that time, I don't think they really had enough time to know that it was going to be a dud. But like I said, 10 years, 3 or 4 airplanes, 5, 6, maybe at the most if I'm leaving some out, certainly no more than that. Whereas in the first 2 or 3 years of Light Sport, we had 30 or 40 or 50 new designs. I've lost track of them. I would report as many as 4 a month. For a couple of years this went on. And so there's no comparison between the success of Light Sport compared to primary category.
How much of the success of LSA early on was tied to the fact that the regs were kind of close to the microlight regulations already in place, and so you sort of had a number of airplanes that could be brought into the category relatively easily?
It certainly had to inform FAA a lot as they thought about what to do with this because the European regulations did predate the U.S. regulation. However, the European regulations were built on the old style system where government would create some standards and the industry followed them. Now, at least that's how they say it. In reality, government created standards are often done by industry anyway. They have the government mark on them and there are lots of government people involved. But industry is a major competitor to any regulation in any industry. Government doesn't have that expertise. They have to call it industry. It just changed rather subtly, but significantly with going to an industry consensus standards where the industry actually writes the original rule, although FAA is always in the room. But it's not quite the same force that it is otherwise. They can suggest things like, oh, you should say shall there, not could. It works like that. They get into the regulatory environment then. But that's what it's going to take for them to say yes, so they have to do it that way. But those people just, they pursued it as best they could at that time. And, FAA didn't really know how this was going to work. Boy, you look back now 30 years, though, primary category, it took a lot of government effort to create that thing. It took a lot of industry effort to try and meet it. And it just didn't work, much like recreational pilot. I don't know that the number ever hit 1,000 for rec pilot license holders.
Oof.
After all those years. So it clearly wasn't the right thing. It was still too much regulation, some reduction in the requirement, but not enough to really, it just wasn't a viable solution. And I think that's why during that time they were kind of going, geez, we're not getting the airplanes out of this. What's happening here? Somebody, I suspect it may have been in the form of Earl Lawrence, who then was with EAA and subsequently went to work for FAA himself, but who had the ear of those people, a real smart guy and knew kind of the right words to say had a background in knowing what ASTM was all about. And I think it may have been him as much as anyone, obviously others too, but who went and said, hey, look, there's this other way we could do this thing. And it will unburden government and give industry more input into what happens. And I think now we can see that that turned out to be quite a success 20 years later.
Was there, to your recollection, any pushback from the traditional aircraft manufacturers, the Cessnas and Pipers of the world at that point to say, hey guys, why do these newcomers get a pass on regulations and certification when we have to play the old game? Was there any of that?
Honestly, Mark, I think they didn't see it coming. It looked too small. It was little toy airplanes. These guys are fiddling around on their own. Yeah, FAA's got its imprimatur on it somehow, but so, we're going to have to deal with them. But, they were pretty innocent little airplanes at first. There were no IFR airplanes at the beginning. They weren't that fast. A lot of them didn't look all that good. They were still in a development phase. I don't think industry worried about it too much until they started to sell some, and then even more than the number of units sold, the rapid development of these aircraft. I mean, it was no time at all before every light sport had GPS in it. That was not common at the time. In 2004, very few airplanes had GPS in them. I know that sounds like ridiculous today, but that's the way it was,
right?
Just 20 years ago. And so here comes these little toy airplanes, in air quotes, and they've got sophisticated equipment on them. And then they had autopilots, and all of a sudden these things became like, hey, these guys can do all this stuff. And now, your point, they went, well, wait a minute, they didn't have to jump through all these hoops we did. So then I think there got to be some pushback, but by then the horses are out of the barn. I mean, you can't do much at that point.
Exactly. And let's not forget, one of the drivers of this literally was the Rotax 912, which had been out for a few years, or actually been out for almost a decade by the time LSA became rule. And it literally powered this category. It was the right engine at the right time, at the right weight, good fuel economy. And by then, it had a really good reputation. I mean, early on, and I had a very early 912, the guys would walk by the hangar and go, what's that little thing? That's, really not knowing what it was. It almost like the scene out at the beginning of 2001 where, the apes, what is that obelisk? I have no idea. So literally the 912 helped drive these because it helped create airplanes that were light enough to get under the category or under the weight limitation. So what's your take on that? How important do you think that was to the category?
Well, I think it was important, but I remember back that also another historical reference. I believe that engine was introduced in 1992. So 1992, right. The Rotax 912 comes out, at least to Americans. I'm sure it's available in Europe. To Americans that arrived in 1992, as I recall. So here, the next year, primary category comes out. Was that a factor? Well, not really, because the earliest airplanes there, the first one, the Quicksilver GT500, used a Rotax 582, a two-stroke engine.
Yes, it did. Yeah,
at that time. Now, later it went to the 912. But I think you're right that was I think it took them about a decade, too. Yeah. Because I started to work with Rotax in various ways through my website, and they were... I remember getting pushback, and I remember going to Rotax once and went, somehow you need to adjust your marketing. You're a European company. You're not used to, waving your hands in the air and trying to get attention like American companies may do more readily. And I try to encourage them, me among many others, I'm sure, but to say, look, you need to really promote what you've got, because you get this great little engine, this tiny little displacement. This works in small airplanes. And it's a fairly modern engine. We hadn't had much engine development in the U.S. We got some great engines, but they're old great engines.
Yeah.
And so these guys came along and really, and now that remember the first one was 80 horsepower.
Yep.
And that engine is still available, still a great engine. It uses regular gas and some other things that make it kind of interesting. But now that same basic body is producing twice as much power, 160 horsepower they got that up to. So in that 20 years, Rotax was not idle either. And they're 70, 80% of the market globally. Good heavens. I mean,
right.
It's a phenomenal achievement that they've done, those folks in Austria.
So in a lot of ways, it was a sort of perfect circle that you had the regulations come along. You had companies that were eager to produce aircraft, but didn't want to go through the certification hassles and the time and the money to do it. You had an engine ready to go, and you had a marketplace that was ready for some new hardware, if you will, hopefully at a better price. I mean, I think early on we hoped they would be really inexpensive airplanes. They turned out not to be as inexpensive as we had hoped. It's a reality of building airplanes, but I think LSA coalesced at a time when there was not just the supply of the ideas and the hardware, but the demand for it and a thirst for it. Would you agree to that?
I would. And I would add one other element to that, Mark, that so the U.S. market for this class of airplane, now, the U.S. is the biggest market, both in production and use for certified aircraft and larger aircraft. But in this class of lightweight two-seaters and single-seaters and so forth, the American community, was basically a kit organization. We didn't have fully built. They weren't allowed under those conditions, except experimental exhibition, things like that, but those are low volume deliberately. However, the Europeans did have regulations that allowed them to fully build and sell essentially the same aircraft. So when the wave hit, when the regulation passed and there was this wave, it was a European wave. They were 70, 80%, maybe more of the aircraft at first because they were already producing ready-to-fly airplanes, and they could meet this regulation. They had a slightly lower category, so it was easy for them to, bulk up a little bit, put some more features on them, still come in the category. At the same time, though, again, we go back to time value of money, because in 20 years' time, those first LSA we thought about, I remember the number people would say $50,000 or $60,000. This is for a ready-to-fly. So, sometimes the first one I imagine is the Flight Design SW, or actually CT2K, the first one was. And here's this carbon fiber cantilevered airplane that you can have for $50,000 or $60,000. Pretty amazing. Now, they're a lot more expensive than that today, probably approaching 4 times as expensive today. But 2 factors happen. First of all, time value of money again. I mean, if you just do the calculations, 50 or 60,000 is like 80 or 90,000 today.
Right.
And probably it's more than that. So, half of that number is just pure inflation. But the other half is that people wanted more stuff and more capabilities and more features and bigger, more powerful engines and fancier panels and 3-screen, electronic instrumentation that was unheard of, not too many years ago. So the demands were very high for these things, and the primary buyers of them were not a lot of new pilots, as FAA and many in the industry once hoped. They were people, if you were downsizing or right-sizing, you might say, to an aircraft, they had a bonanza, they no longer needed that for their business, couldn't really justify the expense of operating and maintaining it. So, here comes along these pretty little airplanes that got some nice features. And here's a story I love to tell. I won't reveal names or airplanes because it's not important, but the story was a common one. I'm waiting to interview somebody, the vendor of an airplane. He's talking to a customer, and I never want to interrupt a customer conversation. So I just kind of hung back and waited to talk to him. And I walked up on the conversation where the customer was saying, well, what else you got? Now, the prior to that story was, here was a guy who had gone up to talk to an LSA vendor. He had just sold his Bonanza. His wife said, yes, you can go buy one of these airplanes, but whatever is left over, I'm buying jewelry. So the guy has asked the vendor for every option he could possibly find. And as I walked up in this conversation, he's going, what else you got? He was ready to buy any and everything he could put on that airplane because he'd sold an airplane that was worth a lot more. He had the cash, and he was trying to get as much of it as he could into airplanes and not jewelry. And so that was common. But that's what a lot of people were doing. So the prices of these things just kept going up and up because people asked for more stuff and got it. And they're quite capable airplanes today, but they are not the super affordable ones that we once thought.
That's true. And I think your point is well taken that the cost of materials today has gone up significantly. Everything from engines, avionics, probably not as much if you take into account the capability that you have now with the modern full screen EFISs and things like that. But engines, propellers, certainly raw materials, composites have become a lot more expensive. So it's easy to understand why the airplanes today aren't the $50,000 and $60,000 airplanes. And truthfully, there probably weren't too many of those that came at that price point. I remember the flying the Quicksilver actually right after it got primary category, and we're talking about, okay, this is what the face of an inexpensive airplane looks like. And certainly no offense to the airplane because it's terrific in its category, but it's like if you're expecting a Cessna 150, you're going to be a little bit surprised at what this is. So It's interesting to
Or
see
in that
where the
sport category, I would say.
exactly,
And there
and
it
that
filled this role magnificently well, and it's still a
absolutely,
reliable airplane today.
yep.
But yeah, you're right. This is not going to replace that cabin enclosure, creature comforts. This was a wind in your face,
Right,
open cockpit biplane, albeit type,
right.
a different animal altogether.
And I think if you come from especially a 172 or 182 or something like that, the handling qualities are just different. They are naturally going to be that because of the configuration. And I remember getting in it the first time, it's got cable flight controls and things like this is really odd. And it took me an hour or so to sort of, recalibrate my mind around it and really enjoyed flying it. But it's like, if you don't have the patience to fly this the way it wants to be flown, you're not going to be a very happy camper. I have a question for you that I've heard different answers to, and I'm really curious to hear your take on it. The 1320-pound max gross weight limitation, or the part of the rule, is often derided by people, and particularly now as we have MOSAIC coming up that will release us from that as a limitation set by the FAA to keep these guys kind of in their category. In other words, there are some airplanes that by design could have been heavier than 1320, but we're limited by that. And therefore that makes useful load a little tricky in some airplanes. And what I heard was there was a fair bit of politics around that and some campaigning, within the industry for that. What's your recollection of that? I'm curious, since you were on the ground at the time.
Well, remember I referenced the European connection there, and the fact that those countries and companies had different regulations that they could apply to very light aircraft and things of that nature. And Germany had its own, what they call ultralight. It's not our ultralight, but they had let's call it microlight just to not confuse things. That's actually a different one in England. But anyway, there were these other ones there, and in FAA doing their surveying, their researching of what other people have and how they should craft their own regulations. They looked at that, and 1,320 pounds is 600 kilograms. And that, that's obviously a European number to use kilograms, but that was a number that they found was a common high point at that time for the German and Italian and other microlights at that time. That was about the peak of what they were. So it was a logical decision in one way. And remember, they were trying to limit kinetic energy, if you will. If the thing weighs less and it flies slower, when it hits something, the damage is a lot less. And indeed, there has been some merit to that whole thing along the way. We are entering into a new phase when we go to MOSAIC and 3,000-pound airplanes. It's going to change things somewhat because we're going further and further away from that sport context where you feel the airplane more, and instead you're referencing instrumentation and your controls may be enhanced in various ways with springs or other systems to make them nicer to fly, perhaps, but it disconnects you from the actual feel of the air to some extent. Fortunately, a lot of people still like that, and fortunately, they still got a lot of airplanes left to choose. They won't all go to the MOSAIC route, and there's one of the reasons why.
And that makes sense. There's still definitely a place for these lighter weight, simpler airplanes in this category. It's a good opportunity to expand it out. We certainly still have a huge gap between that and the lowest cost certified aircraft. And that gap is big and getting bigger. So MOSAIC, for its part, I think will help fill that. And I'm very hopeful about MOSAIC. I'm a little skeptical that we'll have a lot of airframes all of a sudden, but I think over time we'll see this, as LSA was, really a successful program. I want to go back to the issue of safety. Early on, there was some concerns like, well, we have really lightweight airplanes, we have non-certified airplanes, and what is the safety record likely to look like? And I guess we were always a little pessimistic when you saw that, but it has turned out to be a really strong success story. The airplanes have been safe. The pilots have done well with it when they're trained properly for the airplane, and it seems like it's been really positive on that front. Do you feel like there were processes put in place at the time? Was there a mindset at the time that like, hey, we got to really, put on our big boy pants here and do a good job with these airplanes, or we're not going to have them very long?
Well, let's come back to that number again, 1,320 pounds or 600 kilograms. when you make an airplane lighter, the demands are also less. It doesn't have to be as strong in certain parts of it. It doesn't have to be as thoroughly tested. I'm not saying that anybody took shortcuts or anything. They're just not required to do as much when the airplane doesn't weigh as much. Think about a fighter jet going a zillion miles an hour, or airliner with all that weight and everything. My goodness, all the parts better all work together pretty darn well because you have a big, heavy thing there going fast. These airplanes with their lightweight and slow speeds, the demands were less. So it was easier to do the things they needed to do. And all of that translates, again, back to cost. So these things came in at significantly less cost. And yeah, we're seeing some of these LSA, the seaplanes that tend to be the most complex perhaps, hitting and even exceeding $400,000, an unbelievable number given what we thought 20 years ago. But at the same time, the GA airplanes have continued to accelerate too. I mean, the nearest thing, Cessna 172 sometimes mentioned, I believe now is in excess of 500,000.
When you look at the accident rates early on with the light sport aircraft, we tended to find a lot of pilots who were coming from bigger, heavier airplanes and either not getting their heads around the reduced mass and the lower landing speeds, or not getting well trained, or a combination of the two. Really, the accident rate was a matter of kind of runway prangs and occasionally collapsed gear and stuff like that, which I would put as sort of it's a real minor effect, and it's all under sort of what Ron Wantaya would call pilot miscontrol. So it was something that was completely within our control, so to speak, as pilots. The airplanes themselves, with a few exceptions, like I said, about lightweight landing gear and stuff, which really was just a matter of getting the weight out of the airplane so you had some useful load. With those exceptions, I think they did really well early on.
Well, I like to repeat that FAA has said about this category that its safety record is quote unquote acceptable, which is about as high praise as those guys are ever going to use on something like this.
Yeah, they never get excited about that. They never say it's excellent. No, it's acceptable. Yeah.
No, they just won't say that. I get that. I kind of get that. But the truth of it is the airplanes, I think, kind of surprised them because the industry, as they make these standards, sure, they made mistakes. The huge difference was they go, oh, wow, that's not right. We can't verify it by that. We need a change in the regulation. If something is important, ASTM can make a change in 30 days. And it could be done in 30 days. And now that's rare when it would happen so quickly. But if there were a couple incidents, you mentioned some wings or tails coming off, and they were very, very few, but there were a couple of such incidents, and the industry raced to get that fixed, when they saw a fix anyway. But all of that kind of leaves out the pilot side too. We don't hear enough about Sport Pilot and its magic of endorsements. But the way that the industry handled that was actually pretty good. That the pilots learned, like you said, they mostly needed transition training. They already knew how to fly. They flew bigger, faster aircraft. They could do that part in their sleep, or not in their sleep, but they could do it very well.
Some of them in their sleep, but that's okay.
Well, maybe you doze off once in a while. I didn't say that out loud, did I? The little guys, though, with their training and so forth, and they're getting endorsements and so forth, they had to learn some of the same things. And these guys learned and taught the other guys how to operate these lighter aircraft. To me, it's the difference between, this is a wild exaggeration, but the difference between a pontoon boat and a jet ski. Pontoon boat's nice and steady on the water. Nobody's too upset. It's kind of, it absorbs things better. You don't notice it as much. It's not very exciting to turn. Whereas the jet ski, you can whip around in circles and you can do tricks with it, but boy, you're going to feel every wave. And that's a rough analogy for the difference in these things. Well, you get a Bonanza pilot that hops into a Quicksilver, and his muscle memory is not quite right. You've got to acquire that. And the good news is it didn't take all that long. And endorsements help people fly with an instructor 2 or 3 hours. The instructor goes, well, you got it. He signs his logbook. You're done. There's no further testing or anything. And that seemed like crazy soup to people at first. What? No test? As it turns out, it's been just as good, if not better, as in the conventional system. So we wait to see what MOSAIC will bring us there. That's an area we don't know enough about, how they're going to handle pilot licensure and operating limitations. It'll be interesting to see what they do there.
I'd like to wrap up our conversation here with a look back in terms of the manufacturer makeup here. I just was looking on the site, on the by Dan Johnson site / Affordable Aviation, coming soon, that the early on in LSA, we had a lot of European manufacturers, and they were the dominant. And we're talking about SLSA, obviously, fully produced airplanes. You look at it today, the top of the leaderboard is what, Zenith and Vans with the RV-12. The Kit Fox is in there, and the Rands are in there. So these are all American companies. How did that happen?
They got the magic. It's a whole different business model. You're building kits. Let's say you're great at doing both. If you're building kits, that's one set of activities that you have to do. A lot of it is tech support. If you're building fully built airplanes, well, you don't have hardly any tech support. Well, you do, but with mechanics. But you got to build the whole thing. And so they're totally different business models. The Europeans have never really pursued the kit market too much because they don't have much of one in Europe. There's kits over there, of course, but there's nothing like it is here. Not as well developed as it is here. So the U.S. remains the primary kit market in the world. And the fully built market now, these guys that did kits, like Vans is a great example, not their late turbulence and so forth, but prior to that, they did a good job. They built just kits. They built one SLSA, and then they just did ELSAs. And then they engaged, I forget their name right now, but another company right near them, and they fully built them, and then they brought it back in-house. Well, there you go. There's a logical business series of steps. Let somebody else do it, see if we can make it work. Oh, yeah, what do you know? We can make that work. All right, we're going to bring it back in here now, and we're going to do it. I think they did, again, not including their recent challenges, but prior to that, they ran that thing very well. Well, so did Rands, and so did Kit Fox. And these other companies, they took note. They kept their kit businesses going, which was smart, and I think that's still dominant for all of them, but they learned to add the fully built in. Rands is quite adept at that. In fact, so popular that their S-21 has a 5-year wait right now.
Can you believe that?
No, they've got the sales out that far because they do a good job with it, and they are limiting the number because that's what works.
I think you could say in the case of these particular companies, the kit side of the business is supporting or even subsidizing the SLSA or the other way around. But certainly they get some economies of scale of using the same manufacturing processes. Sure. They're really just adding labor at the factory to complete these airplanes. And in many cases, I know this is true with Kit Fox, that labor can be deployed in other places. So if you decide you don't have the demand for it or whatever the situation is, it's not like the person goes home and doesn't come in until you have an order. There's certainly ways to make that work. Well, Dan, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I think as we look back on a couple of decades of light sport aircraft and sport pilot, there's no way to see it as anything but successful. It's laid the groundwork for MOSAIC as that expansion for LSA. And I think in our last conversation, when we talked about going forward with MOSAIC, it's easy to sort of forget about light sport as it is, and it's going to continue to thrive. I think there's certainly a lot of activity in the category. And I'm excited to see it. And I appreciate you, providing your background on this. I was just poking into it and just sort of paying attention to it at the time, but you were in up to the knees or maybe the hips, and I appreciate that perspective.
Well, I kept my nose out of the water anyway, but I was in pretty deep on it. And you know what? I've gone away, and this is going to be an exciting ride. We've had a wonderful 20 years of LSA. And all those other years that led to that, and MOSAIC is just going to add a whole new dimension to this. The LSA guys, I think most of them can still keep producing a lot of these same airplanes, and I'll bet they sell in similar numbers as today. They may slip somewhat because these MOSAIC, they're going to be more capable, and that translates to more expensive. So they're going to appeal to a slightly different class. Nothing wrong with that. Fills all needs. That's what we want. But the people that want to go out and fly something they can really afford to operate and maybe even carry in a trailer or whatever their needs may be, those aircraft are still going to be LSA and kits. I don't see those types of airplanes changing much. In fact, their appeal might even grow once we confront the cost of a well-equipped MOSAIC airplane. So
right, we'll look at those and go,
it's going to be fun.
Right. I was thinking that was too small an airplane, but at this price point, it may be just exactly what I need. Now, we may well see a lot of that.
Our needs change as the aircraft producers' needs change.
Fair point. Well, thanks again, Dan. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the weeks ahead. We've got air venture about to show up on the radar here. It feels like that time is condensing by the minute until we get there. I'm sure there'll be some interesting things going on there. But in the meantime, we look forward to getting our own flying seasons off. Well, you're in Florida. You have 24/7 flying season. I don't hear about it, but and anyway, thank you.
As we're talking here, somebody just took off. So
I love it. Well, all right. Well, thanks again, Dan, and we'll I'm sure we'll chat here. We'll find something else fun to chat about, and we'll bring it up on this channel.